For many years, I've been coming here to Switzerland to write. Although not many writers realize it, writing must be a lonesome, lonely business. So, as usual, I welcome a change. On this sunny Sunday morning, my wife, Catherine, and I propose a visit to a Landesgemeinde, to the People's Parliament of Canton Glarus. It's the first step in seeing how democracy answers to the issues we've been discussing in these programs. How leaders are selected, how the selection differs in different countries, how people inform themselves for participation, and what education serves the needs of a democracy. Switzerland is the classic democracy. Also the classic federalism. It is the obvious place to begin on this voyage of discovery.
Zeit, Landsgemeinde, Kinder. Und wir zusammen rum.
They'll be arriving by now, on foot, in my car, and by train. Power is distributed between the federal government in Bern, the 22 cantons, and the 3,000 communes, local governments. In Britain and the United States, the popular instinct is always, nationally and locally, to look for leaders who can solve problems. In Switzerland, the popular instinct is to solve problems. That's one reason so few Swiss leaders are known outside the country. The last Swiss of great fame was Calvin, who, of course, was a theologian, not a politician, and really French. Before that, I suppose it was William Tell, who is remembered not for politics, but for his rather perilous approach to parental duty. And current leaders are unknown even to the Swiss. Kitty, you ready? There's no royal family here. In a true republic, there should never be a first lady. Besides, if you become the first woman president, you wouldn't want me to be called the first gent, would you? And now off to Lauenen. I think I'm going to be called the flower child. Soldiers are here too. But they were civilians yesterday, and they'll revert this afternoon. Or, as the Swiss would insist, they're civilians now. You dress properly, and you're told not to smoke. Government is a serious business, and you wouldn't light up in the House of Commons.
Bauern, Arbeiter, Hausfrauen, Angestellte und Industrielle, Männer und Frauen aus allen Regionen unseres Landes.
Where there are too many people to meet as a parliament, there are elections. In some cantons, almost every Sunday. Nearly all elections are to decide questions, very few to decide who should hold office. This is the essence of the Swiss direct democracy. Local issues are decided locally, as here, and money is spent by the people who pay. This question of money is the true passion behind Swiss federalism. In Scotland, Wales, Quebec, federalism is a new and dangerous radicalism. Here it is an ancient conservatism.
Banknoten im hinteren Fach, dort dürfen wir rausgehen, aber die Münze vorne, da ja nicht. Das ist zu viel.
For the issues within Swiss control, the direct democracy works and wonderfully well. It wouldn't keep Switzerland safe in a war, but it still keeps her people prosperous, contented, employed in an economically unstable world.
Ebenfalls versucht haben, aufzuheben.
You vote. The vote is on problems and not on people.
Ebenfalls versucht haben, aufzuheben. Das grössere Mehr, Sie haben die Ziffer 8. Danke. Wer hingegen noch Antrag
The politics of Switzerland is the politics of problems, of decision. In the United States and Britain, we build great monuments to house our leaders, our politicians. Here, the only monument that remains at the end of the day is the paper that was discarded and the business that was done. This political temple is only a little more than 100 years old, and the Capitol in Washington is about the same age. Reverence of people for their institutions and of politicians for their profession unite to give the impression of a much greater age. Both countries have their totems of political worship, their fragments of the true political cross. In Britain, for centuries, it has been the House of Commons and the common law. In the United States, of course, it's the Constitution. Supernatural forces have presided over the founding of both. For the people crossing this bridge, Parliament is the protector and the surrogate. But they also now look for protection to other institutions. They look to trade unions, business firms or corporations, political lobbies. All of these now share power with the modern Parliament. It's a fact of life, one not easily accepted and the source of much worry. Some on this bridge don't look anywhere. It's still pretty early in the morning. Our politics differs in two major respects from that of the Swiss. Theirs, we saw, was the politics of problems, of issues. Ours in both Britain and the United States is the politics of leaders. They ask how problems can be solved. We ask for the man or the woman who will solve them. This is the source of a unique schizophrenia in our politics. Writers of major political weight in England, the self-anointed descendants of those who paid for their defense of Parliament by residence here, deplore the weakening of Parliament by the executive. Sages of equally transcendental insight in America regret the usurpation of the powers of the Congress by the President. Both go on to plead then for a return of the great prime ministers and the strong presidents of the past, who would, of course, weaken these legislatures yet more. This is Cambridge, Trinity Great Court. Trinity men have always supposed, I've thought rightly, that they were chosen, meant to lead. It used to be said in my time that God, too, was a Trinity man. So it is not a bad place to pursue this question of leadership in a democracy. What makes a leader great in eyes other than his own? To what qualities do people respond? I lived once in Neville's Court, just through this arch. The wonderful Wren Library is just beyond. It is perhaps the most gracefully enclosed space in all the world. Or anyway, that's my claim. The political leader that I knew the best was educated here, Jawaharlal Nehru. He early knew, or in any case sensed, the essence of leadership. It is to confront, without doubt or equivocation, the major aspiration, the greatest need, the gravest anxiety of the people you presume to lead. For Nehru as for Gandhi, this was independence for India. Independence for both men was more than a president and a parliament and an end to British rule. It was also the dignity and the equality of all the Indian people. Nehru moved easily among Europeans and Americans, often with a poorly concealed sense of his better education, greater style, more aristocratic background. In later years, he refused to think of himself as a Brahmin, a thought that's not easily cured. But Jawaharlal Nehru committed himself wholly, totally to the political aspirations of the Indian people. Imprisonment, jail, was a normal consequence of this commitment. This was the ultimate source of his influence, his power. Without this commitment, his informed mind, his much praised ability to communicate with his people, his other qualities, would have counted for exactly nothing. His name would not now be known. Cambridge and Trinity, I'm sure, gave Nehru the assurance that allowed him to make this commitment. The feeling that in his drive for Indian independence he was unshakably right. As so often before in these programs, Smith, Marx, Lenin, Keynes, we have a leader coming not from the masses but from the mandarins. English education in Nehru's time was very good at producing such men, and on occasion women too. Nehru once told me, half seriously, that he would be the last Englishman to govern India. On hunger, deprivation, population growth, Nehru's education was in the great, untidy, chaotic world outside the college walls. On these problems, he was not secure, and his commitment was not firm, and his leadership suffered. The qualities that worked for Nehru's leadership, certainty of purpose, a full commitment to the present anxieties of the people, should stand the test when applied to other leaders. And they do. They were the prime characteristic of the greatest American political leader of the 20th century, Franklin D. Roosevelt. The challenge, the anxiety that made Roosevelt a leader was economic, not political. The challenge of economic success or failure is a more recent thing than we imagine. Until well into the present century, economic problems were local problems. They could be solved by local businessmen and their local politicians, and therefore by the local leadership. Harrisville, New Hampshire, like Fatapersikri and Bruges, retains its uncluttered past, allows us to see what progress elsewhere has destroyed. Bethuel Harris established woolen mills here at the beginning of the last century. With his two sons, he dominated the economics and politics of the town until 1850. Then the Colony family took over and ran things with only 3 changes in management for the next 100 years. For the first 130 years of Harrisville, there was no economic problem that Bethuel or the colonies couldn't solve. Cloth could always be sold at a price. Wages could then be lowered to meet that price, and this was a remedy for unemployment. Unions did not protest. There were no unions. Productivity was maintained by working a good, rugged 12-hour day. The Harrises in the colonies also ran the town, provided housing for workers and a cemetery in which to bury them at the end. They regulated the use of alcohol and tobacco and watched over sex and religion. But in time, there were problems that the Harrises in the colonies could not solve. There was competition from more efficient southern mills. Economic society as a whole was becoming more complex and less stable. The extent of these changes and the resulting loss in local power was shown by the Great Depression and with a traumatic force. It's hard to understand nowadays the bewilderment and the anxiety it produced in places like Harrisville. National leaders, Herbert Hoover, Heinrich Brüning, Ramsay MacDonald, shared in this bewilderment. Then in 1933 came Roosevelt. He accepted that economic solutions had to be national solutions, something that even the Swiss were discovering in these years. He committed himself fully to those solutions and therewith to the anxieties of unemployed workers and bankrupt farmers and broken businessmen and all who lived in the ghastly fear that they would be the next. If Roosevelt had doubts about his course, he did not let anyone know. The government would support prices and purchasing power, except that a balanced economy might require an unbalanced budget, as both Keynes and Irving Fisher had advised. His was not a revolution, but a piecemeal patchwork reform. What counted was the Roosevelt commitment. Had it been half-hearted, his name, like those of MacDonald and Brüning and Herbert Hoover, would now scarcely be known. Roosevelt's leadership, more than incidentally, saved American democracy. The American democracy, like the economy, like this engine which climbs to a New Hampshire mountaintop up Mount Washington, is not exactly a streamlined job. For some passengers, there was still much discomfort and some moments of panic. Much was owed to the diligence and ingenuity of those who manned the political and economic machinery and kept it in repair. But since Roosevelt, almost everyone has preferred to remain on board. In very recent years, the United States has been moving strongly toward greater participation, greater democracy in the selection of its leaders. Once in past years, this selection was accomplished by the party bosses. Their followers were told exactly what they should do.
It takes 20 minutes to find out if they can hear something or not.
The occasion for telling them what to do was, of course, the National Convention. Delegates from the rural South might not get their railroad tickets home if they didn't vote as they were told. And others from the northern cities would face the loss of jobs, of graft, maybe even jail. if they didn't respond to their bosses, Mayor Haig, Mayor Kelly, Mayor Curley, Boss Pendergast. It was by these men that Roosevelt was selected by the Democrats in 1932. But now, no longer. The National Convention is a dying institution. Here's Robert Strauss, National Chairman.
It's been a long road since 1972 back to the Democrats.
Bob, do you have the feeling that the whole political process is sort of moving out into the country, and that the convention in some ways is a declining institution?
Well, let me say this. The impact of the convention in pure political terms is possibly a declining institution, but it's sort of like a 4th of July celebration in some respects. It's a lot of joy and a lot of rededication and a commemoration of things and a meeting of old friends.
All right, lighting is low level, but we will go to the band.
Are you the only surviving Udall delegate? The feeling he's going to be nominated. In selecting the candidates, it's the people that now have the play. Their chance came a month before the convention, here in California on primary day. The polls have just closed in Los Angeles. The ballots come in by helicopter. Bags are checked for metal, maybe something like a bomb. Then they're checked for obvious fraud, and the crooked and bent cards are taken out and counted separately because they can screw up the computer. Then the computer takes over. Some argue that the solution has not been all that much improved. That in the last 200 years, as Gene McCarthy once said, democracy has marched on from George Washington to Richard Nixon, John Adams to Spiro Agnew, and from John Jay to John Mitchell. As with many others, although I confess it, my commitment to democracy is really an act of faith. I'm not open to argument on the alternatives. But I do also think there is rational ground for believing it to be both stronger and safer than any other form. It's because weakness and danger in the modern state come when there is a rift, a division between governing and governed. When people can feel that the government is not theirs, the more democratic the process, the less is this danger. The smaller this weakness. The people who put ballots in these boxes are by that very act inoculated against the feeling that the government is not theirs. They accept by that act that its errors are their errors, its aberrations are their aberrations, and that a revolt will be against themselves. It's really a remarkably clever arrangement when one thinks of it. None of this means that democracy is more intelligent than other forms of government. And I don't think it necessarily is. That depends on the means by which people are informed. This is the last of the big primaries. For better or worse, when the computer here is finished, we will almost always know who the presidential candidates will be. One of two men will be president. The conventions are for show, for the anchor men and the orators. The power here is in the hands of the people. Let no one think that this is a negligible power. that it is an engine without steam. One candidate then survives. Considering the incredibly exhausting process of selection, survival is a very good work. The culmination of this long process in the United States is the election of the president, the pinnacle, the mountaintop of leadership. Does this in turn negate democracy? Is the presidential power imperial? And must it be? We've had two very practical tests of this in recent time. One was Watergate, where abuse of presidential power brought the dismissal of Richard Nixon. But there was another more interesting and more difficult case. It occurred when authority is always thought to be the greatest during a war. It was something I saw at rather close range. For most politicians, the Vietnam War presented a nasty problem. It was how to be for both war and peace, how to oppose an unpopular conflict and stand foursquare behind our boys. All who so straddled eventually achieved the obscurity for which one judges nature intended them. Eugene McCarthy decided to test the democratic process against that of the pinnacle, the presidency. Perhaps I had something to do with his decision. By the mid-60s, I was strongly against the war, and we discussed it a number of times. And one day in the autumn of 1967, I spoke on another mountaintop. It was about 100 miles from here on Mount Ascutney in a ski lodge. We'd expected 100 people or so. And when I got there, the mountain was covered with people. It's a very heady business, a sermon on the Mount. I talked again after that with Gene, told him my impression, and so did others. And he decided against all political calculation to take on the battle. And here in March in 1968, in the New Hampshire primary, McCarthy and a host of volunteer supporters who came in buses from all over the countries came within a very few votes of defeating Lyndon Johnson on the issue of the war. A president at the peak of his power was brought down. A few weeks later, he stopped the bombing, withdrew from the presidential race. I'm not sure all people yet know what happened. In the middle of a war, a great country stopped, considered, rejected all the forces of chauvinism and patriotism, stood against the generals and the bands and the music, and called off the conflict. This was the democratic power. Perhaps it hadn't happened before, but it did happen then. Eugene McCarthy was a gifted man with an ear for music and a sense of the effect of words, a poet. He knew, or anyhow sensed, the power of commitment, the power that had been exercised so effectively by Nehru and Roosevelt. But however this may be, he showed better than anyone in recent times that leadership, even when it is opposed, when it is at the presidential pinnacle, if it's faced by an aroused democracy, can be a secondary thing.
I've no doubt in my mind that if we elected John Kenneth Galbraith, President of the United States, and 535 of his most faithful and loyal students as members of Congress, that this legislation is likely to achieve the aim...
What gives power to people and their legislators? To lead, to participate, to bring their leaders and anointed sages back to earth as needed. Let all who advocate this legislation be mature. Let us not imagine that God is a liberal gentleman who will work miracles for liberals merely because he loves his own. Part of this power depends on the further power I've mentioned, the power to inform. I've spent a good deal of time before congressional committees. The same thought always sustains me. This is a central function of modern government. Presidents can control legislation. They cannot, to their regret, control investigation. As Congress brought out the full story of the conflict, opposition to the Vietnam War increased and hardened. And it wouldn't have happened otherwise. It was also the investigatory power, the power to inform, that brought down Richard Nixon.
Why this, which is far more comprehensive, far more difficult to achieve?
It's a process which retains its vigor and is not, fortunately, graced by any unnecessary politeness. On occasion, it informs the witness of his more obvious faults.
With all due respect, Professor Galbraith, to your national and international reputation, I have some very distinct disagreements with your basic philosophy. I get a little bit tired of the catchword, anything that's good, motherhood, we attach progressive to it. And somehow that's supposed to make it great and wonderful and the savior of us poor dumb citizens who don't have PhDs in economics. But I do know that the liberal philosophy has been tried for all of the years that I have been alive, and I credit that for most of the problems of the economy. We haven't talked about $75 billion budget deficits. We haven't talked about bureaucracy. The chairman talked today about what we tried to do.
As far as the cost, Senator, I'm sure you would agree that the costs will depend entirely on the extent of the unemployment that is to be dealt with by the bill.
That's the typical philosophy here, that if a program fails, we didn't fund it enough. Put some more money in it. Hire some more people. I'm sorry, I just can't buy the philosophy on the basis of hindsight. I only took Econ 1, 2, and 3 as a banking and finance major. I don't know all the economic theory. I'm not sure I understand M1 and M2 and all the stuff I hear in this committee. But I do hope I have developed a little 20/20 hindsight and some common sense to see what happens. But I'd like to try the conservative philosophy just for a few years. And I'd be perfectly willing, if we were proven wrong, to say, boy, you're wrong, you failed. But I think the other way has failed. And I think to ask for continue more government, I agree that it's a political police state. With the other things we are doing in this committee.
But the greatest source of democratic power, we should not doubt, derives from education. This requires our deeper attention. When education allows people to resolve issues with intelligence, select leaders with discrimination, and trains leaders that are worth selecting, well, the answer brings me back to familiar and beloved scenes, to the University of California. I was here during the early 1930s, and we then regarded it as the best university in the world. And I'm glad to say that there are a lot of people who have since come to share our insight. Undergraduates in my day were not very much interested in politics. The principal symbols of undergraduate achievement were sex, alcohol, and idleness, with a certain commitment to intercollegiate athletics. But in the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson, the Vietnam War, and the hot breath of the local draft boards succeeded where the books and the professors had failed. There was a massive questioning of the wisdom of public authority here at Berkeley, and that questioning, some called it a revolt, which began here, spread to universities around the world. Anywhere in the world, one mentioned Berkeley, and people began discussing the relationship between education and democracy. This lovely campus is a good place to ask what kind of education serves the democratic purpose. It's an even better place to see the conflict that education involves. We want the largest possible number of participants in democratic discussion, and the tens of thousands that this university enrolls are proof of the seriousness of that intention. We want them to believe that in a democracy they are sovereign, have the right and the responsibility and the power to decide. And we want also to train leaders, men and women who are equipped with the knowledge and the self-confidence, and maybe also the self-esteem, to decide for others, and then to win acceptance for their will, because that's the meaning of leadership. So we ask for leaders, and we ask for followers who are told that leadership belongs to them. Our only hope is that some conflicts are irreconcilable in principle, but not in practice. This university shows, I think, that we need not despair. We all agree that pessimism is a mark of superior intellect, and it may well be a spur to greater effort. But occasionally we should reflect on achievement, as long as it doesn't become a habit. For centuries, the races stood apart. Whites always above, blacks always below. They have come together. Education, the schools, we all know, was the scene of this struggle. But it was also the source of the success. In the late 1960s, Jimi Hendrix, the young black rock musician, performed After much struggle, the people expelled a leader who was false. This had not happened in their history before. There was upset, even violence in some of this. There was much more that was generous and good and wise. Not all of these achievements can be attributed to education. But after 200 years and more, education gives us something to celebrate. Celebration of more than an anniversary, also of progress and rejuvenation. This is the Greek Theater on the Berkeley campus. What we see here, a reminder of the original democracy, is not wholly an accident. The early builders thought it something a university and a democracy should well have. The kind of place where politicians, political leaders, have been coming ever since Pericles to meet the people and to try to persuade them.
That all men are created equal.
The dialectic of the modern industrial society will continue to turn on education. On the one hand, the competitive meritocracy, the will to succeed. On the other hand, the need to submerge personality, be part of the team, accept that politics is the art of the possible. But above this dichotomy is the higher need over which there can be no dispute, and that is the rejection by leaders of evasion. That is the need to see the sources of people's anxieties and concerns and the solutions that are inescapable.
Be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice.
This, I think, is the essence of leadership. A full commitment to the anxieties of the time, a commitment people are given no reason whatever to doubt. And then the ability to change as the problems change. Recalling the lessons of the Swiss, this tells us what education in a democracy, in a successful democracy, must accomplish. It must develop the sense of community that we saw in Switzerland. This specifically is an understanding that in the end, the special interest, one's own interest, is always subordinate to the interest of the community. That's not charity. This is a wholly practical matter. Only the community, local, state, national, international, reflects the well-being, maybe even the survival of all people. The people of a democracy must also be skilled in detecting the person or group that puts its own interest ahead of the community, or maybe claims that the two are the same thing. For it is inevitable that corporations, trade associations, trade unions, generals, bureaucrats, professors will do just that. Democratic education, accordingly, must ensure that all people can identify and will resist the claims of special interest. All must know that the voice of special interest, and that of the affluent in particular, being very loud and very clear, is regularly mistaken for the voice of the masses. The second need concerns the commitment itself. Democratic education must give to men and women the sense of security and purpose that allows them to confront, without any ambiguity, the tasks of the time. And it must help all of them to distinguish between leaders who make such a commitment and those who don't. The highest political craftsmanship, as it's often regarded, consists in avoiding commitment, in responding to the anxieties of the day, while persuading those who might suffer from the resulting action that they have nothing at all to fear. We all know the phrases. Peace through armed strength. An end to poverty, but no expansion of the role of government. As I just said, the politician who is skilled in such legerdemain is greatly praised in modern spectator politics. A great performer, a true professional. A democracy needs to be equally skilled in detecting and then rejecting that kind of evasion, all kinds of evasion. I come now to a final need. All the leaders I mentioned Roosevelt, Nehru, Kennedy, and by the standards of his community, Martin Luther King, had what today would be called an elitist education. Very bad phrase. We come here to the contradiction that I mentioned earlier. All of these men had been trained to believe that they were likely to be right. Thus, they had all been trained to believe that they were right. This gave them the sense of personal security that allowed them to take a stand. They did not feel the need to equivocate. They didn't think others were entitled to say that they were wrong. Education still needs to persuade the very best of its products that it qualifies them to take and to maintain a stand. To what anxiety should we seek commitment by our leaders now? I thought maybe we should ask this question in less cluttered surroundings. Anyway, it was a good excuse to come out to Death Valley, well named for one of our anxieties, a place of singular interest and beauty, and to see the surrounding mountains equally barren, stark, uncompromising in their mood. It's my firm view that it's far easier to understand the problems of modern society than it is to confront them. Much easier to know what needs doing than to win the commitment to doing it. Indeed, we use complexity as a formula for evasion. Matters being, it is said, beyond our comprehension, we then postpone, compromise, yield to the convenience of politics and politicians. Such evasion was not possible in communities like this. Skidoo 23 is in the Panamint Mountains. It flourished as a mining town in the early part of this century. The 23 refers apparently to the distance water was piped over the mountains to the mines. Skidoo was an admirably simple society. No government, no public services, few private services, only the mining of gold. Its one contribution to history was in 1908, the year of my birth. Skidoo's most dubious citizen, one Joe Simpson, shot and killed Jim Arnold, the storekeeper, banker, and chairman of the local establishment. Simpson was strung up on a telephone pole, the wires of which gave the news to the world. Reporters rushed to Skidoo, and the citizens who were already becoming media conscious strung Joe up a second time to show them how justice had been done. For Skidoo, the problem was the economic base. And that was something that on this desert, no one could fail to understand. The economic base is also the problem of the modern metropolis, the inner city, along with finding the public resources that enable people to live together in reasonably safe and civilized fashion. Skidoo, in its own way, shows also how fragile is the fabric of modern urban existence. Once it was a flourishing community of 700 souls. Now the population of Skidoo is precisely nil. Self-interest, the release of individual energies, was what made Skidoo in its few years in the sun. No one looking at these barren hills would imagine that any other force could bring people hundreds and thousands of miles in some cases to bury themselves in the holes that we've seen here. Both Adam Smith and Karl Marx believed such motivation essential in the early stages of industrial development. This is a truth that many in the poor countries do not now confront. Surely there's some socialist or collectivist shortcut even though the organizational and administrative structures on which their success uniquely depends is woefully weak in these lands. These piles of gold were the resource that made Skidoo. They remind us that resources are exhaustible, and of the oldest remedy for poverty when the relationship of resources and people is wrong or goes wrong. In Skidoo and down here in Death Valley, the relation of land to people is strikingly clear. Had people been forced to live here after the minerals were gone, they would have been very poor indeed. So they moved on. The movement of people from the poor countries to the rich has been, we've seen, one of the great solutions for poverty. And it has been so for a long, long time. When it's from poor countries to rich today, it's a remedy that not many people in the receiving countries want to confront. The situation of the poor countries is the same. For them, too, income from outside is an antidote for poverty. And it's no less a remedy when it comes as assistance, aid from the rich countries. This is a fact that we of the fortunate lands also try very hard to forget. This valley has another and yet more somber truth to affirm. It's about 100 miles long, 15 to 20 miles wide. Imagine it to have been urbanized, built up, as the strip of land from Connecticut through New York and New Jersey to Philadelphia is urbanized, or London and the home counties, or the Moscow area, or the Tokyo-Yokohama plain. Imagine that the city and the suburbs cover the whole length and breadth of this valley from the mountains to the mountains. Look at it well. This is how it would look after the explosion of a mere 4 20-megaton bombs. Keep looking. This is a truth we also try very hard and very successfully to evade. The problem is not that the world has got beyond us, that problems are too complex for the human intelligence, democracy too weak. The problem is that we use so much of our intelligence to evade the hard answers.
Is it? What, on the, because they think it's gone into the wrong pocket?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Did it 2 years.
Oh, really?
And that is when he did all his reasoning about foreign policy and foreign affairs.
Next time we propose to see if that is what, in fact, our leaders do, or how they come to grips.
Making promises to the West, they weren't attacking.
No, but they were not attacking, they weren't going that far. But they were all saying,
We've invited a dozen or so world leaders here to Vermont to discuss the questions that have such clarity in Skidoo and such awful clarity in Death Valley, and the other questions that have emerged from these programs. It is to be a test, and we hope an encouraging one, of how leaders commit themselves to our anxieties. preoccupation with the problem. We're never better.